Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we're getting close to wrapping up our CSS chapter. We're going to do a few more videos and then we're going to do some practical real-world examples. So really excited for that, but what I want to do is take a moment to talk about some different ways that we can size things. And specifically what we're talking about here is units. And when we speak of units, we're talking about units of measurement. Okay, so there are many different ways that we can specify some sort of unit of measurement within our page. And so let's dive in and get going on that. So let me switch over to my screen here. And you know what? Let's just stay on this page that we're on with these selectors because we can probably do something pretty cool here. So up until this point, pretty much the only unit of measurement that we've seen is this pixels. Now pixels refers to, and this isn't always 100% accurate, but I do want to say that a pixel is considered one of the absolute lengths, meaning it's going to be relatively the same. Now where this breaks down, so a pixel is exactly 1/96th of an inch. So for an inch, 1/96th of that is 1 pixel. Where that exactly doesn't fit is when you're looking at low resolution devices, to where 1 pixel is actually equal to 1 pixel on the device width, okay? So pixels are pretty predictable though, and it's real easy to understand and reason about pixels. So you'll see pixels a lot in web development. So we've seen a lot of pixels. I don't want to really belabor pixels, but you could change, let's just, for example, let me go up here to the top here. Let's just do our HTML element here just to target the whole document. And what we're going to do is say our font size, and let's put this at 10 pixels. This is going to be really small, but this will kind of give you a basis to understand how big a pixel is. So that's 10 pixels. So that means that this font would be 10 pixel font. Now if I put this up to 18, then we have an 18 pixel font here. Now pixels can be used for margin, padding, and width and height, and all of that. It can also be used for font size, but anytime you're talking about a unit of measurement, you will be using some sort of unit like pixel. Okay, so I'm going to set this back for now to 14, and we'll refresh. So all of these are now 14 pixels, and I'll briefly go over a few of the other absolute length unit types. One that you might see a lot, especially if you're coming from a print world, is point. Now a point is going to get a little bit bigger because a point is 1/72nd of an inch. Okay, so it's really similar to a pixel. It's just a little bit bigger. So it's, instead of 1/96th of an inch, it is 1/72nd of an inch. So basically, if I were to use 72 point font, that would be 1 inch. Okay, so this would be a 1 inch font here. So that's pretty big. Now if I were to use, that should be the same size as a 96 pixel font, and it is. So pixels is 1/96th of an inch, and points are 1/72nd of an inch. All right, so but that's not really all that important. You can do, there's a few other units of measurements like centimeters, millimeters, inch, and so those are pretty much the absolute type of units. Now there are a few other types of units that are relative, and relative units are, let's start off by talking about percent. Okay, so if I were to, let's see, let's find, let me refresh this here. And let's find, well, I'm just going to go back here to the selectors page here. And what we'll do is we'll do a div And we're gonna put some text in here, but let's give this div a class equal to test. I don't know. And then what we'll do is in style.css, let's target that class of test. And what we'll do, just so we can easily see this, is give this a background color, and let's use green. So we'll do 00DD00. And that should be a nice green color. We'll refresh, and now this, other than this padding here in the HTML, this is 100% width of the parent. Now that's by default. Now what I could do is I could say make the width 150 pixels, and then that will be exactly 150 pixels in width. We can also do the height in that same way. So height can also be 150 pixels. And if I refresh, now we have a square. So for width, we can do that. Now we talked about percentage. Now percentage is a percentage of the parent. So by default, a div is going to be, it's not exactly 100%, but it's going to fill the full available space, which isn't the same as 100% because of padding and margin and things like that. But we could say, I want this to be 70% of the parent, and you'll see here, and now this is 70% of the parent available width here. And the parent will be the HTML document. And so if I scale this, that the browser, I make the browser bigger and smaller, you'll see that the box will grow and shrink to stay at that 70% width there. Whereas if I set this exactly to 150 pixels, it doesn't matter how big or small my screen gets, this is going to stay at 150 pixels, so that's not dynamic at all. And sometimes you don't want it to be dynamic, but if you're doing some sort of like dynamic layout where people may be viewing your website on different size screens, like a mobile device or a desktop, on different screens on a desktop, you're going to want to think a little bit more in terms of making things dynamic. And that's where we can start getting to percentages. Another one that we could talk about with width is we could do like 45 VW, and that will stand for view width. And this will pretty much, in this case, it's going to be almost the same as 45%. But if I had this in a parent div that was smaller, this width would still be 45% of the view width, meaning the browser's view is going to be 45% of that. We could also do view height, and yes, we can do that on the width if we want. And the width of this is going to be 45 view height. Now, if I take this and I scale this up and down, you can see actually as I scale the height of this window, it's changing the width. So that's a little funky. You can do something like that if you want. But just know that view height and view width are units that you can use, and those units are based upon the view that the browser has available to it. So those are basically percentages of that, okay? I think what we're going to do now is jump over to, let's talk about, you know what, the other thing I'm going to do here, let's do a little bit of padding here, and I'm going to do 8 pixels, and let's just leave the font the way that it is. And so we got a 14 pixel text here, and I know it's 14 pixels because that's what I set on the root item. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about is really useful if you're going to have, let's say for example, let's say I'm going to have a website that scales, and I want to have fonts that are relative to the root element. So the root element in this case, the font size is set to 14 pixels. So what I could do here is inside this test is I could say font size, and then I can do 1 rem, and that's going to be based upon the root element. So you see it stays the same size, but what happens if I do 3 rem? Okay, so this is actually 3 times larger than our root element, which was 14. And if I go 2 rem, this will be 28 pixels because this is twice the size of our root element. So our root element font size is 14 pixels. So we start there, and then what we could do is we could continue to, based on the root element, we can make our font sizes change in relationship to that root element, okay? And people will do that a lot with for dynamic websites, and what they'll end up doing sometimes is you can set like what's called a media query, and you can say, hey, on mobile devices, I want this root font size to be 12 pixels, and on desktops or sizes that are like 1920 by 1080, I want the root font size to be 18 pixels, okay? And then if you make all of your other elements related or like in relation to that, if you use rems based on that root element, then based on the screen size, all of your other fonts will scale around that. So it's a little bit harder to reason about because you do have to think about what is that root element size. And then you could do things like incremental. You could even do 0.5. So this would end up being 7 pixels, which is tiny there. You could do 0.75 rem. Okay. And then once you could even do like something like, 3.75. And that's almost 4 times larger. So it's 3.75 times the root element, which is 14, okay? So that's rem. Now, not to be confused with rem, you have, well, let me show you one last thing here. And what I want to do here is, let's say inside of that test div, we have, this is a really good reason to do this, and this is a good reason to do both of these, but just inside of here, I'm going to put an H3, and I'm going to put some sort of title here. And then we'll do a paragraph tag, and we'll say this is a paragraph. And let's refresh that now. And then let's go back in here, and let's get rid of this font size 3.75. Because what I can do is I want to refresh that there, and I want to be able to control this title and this paragraph, okay? So, well, actually, let's do it this way. Let's talk about the new one. The new one here is EMs, okay? Now, EMs are like rem, kind of, except for REMs, they grab the root element, okay? EM is going to grab whatever font size of its parent element. So let's go ahead and set this font size here. And let's say inside this test box, I want my base font size to be 14 pixels, okay? If anything gets typed in there, it's 14 pixels, okay? Now they have other styles in play that's messing with this title here. But let's say that root is 14 pixels inside of this. And you know what? Let's make this a little bit bigger just so that it's different from our root element, okay? So now what I'll do is I'm going to say, hey, inside of my test, I'm going to have an H3. And I want that H3 to have a font size equal to 2em. And what we'll see now is this font size is 2 times larger than the font size of this test element. So let's look and inspect that. And you can see that it's set to 2 rem, but let's go to computed. And you can see that the font size, the computed font size, that is 32 pixels. So it's not taking 2 times the root. The root element was 14, so that would be 28. Instead, the EM is taking the font size of this parent div here and basing it upon that. So this is 2em, and that's coming off of this 16 pixels. Okay, so I can also do the same thing with .test paragraph, and let's make that font size, you know what, let's make it a little bit smaller. So I'm going to make this 0.9 EM, and now this paragraph is smaller. Let's see what that ends up being. So if I inspect that element and we go to the computed here and we look at the font size, that's 14.4 pixels. Now, if I were to do 1 EM here, that should be 16 pixels. And indeed, if we look here, the font size for that is 16 pixels. So it doesn't matter what our root element is, unless, in fact, we say, hey, our root element is 14. So inside of test, I want our font size to be 1.1 rem. Now we start getting ultra dynamic here, because this is going to go off of the root element, and then these are going to go off of that. So let's go ahead now and let's see what these turn out to be. If I inspect this element here, we can see that the font size is 30.8 on that, and then with the paragraph, that's 15.4 pixels. So again, the reason why you might want to do this is for, you know, you can make your pages dynamic. And so let's just, should I or should I not? Yeah, I think we'll just leave it there. I was going to create some media queries, but I don't want to confuse anyone. We haven't talked about media queries at all, but just know that you'll see M's and Rems a lot. They are very useful for building scalable, dynamic websites that look good on multiple screen sizes. Okay, so if it needs to be mobile friendly, or you know, it needs to look good on a mobile phone, and then it scales up to a desktop, it needs to look good. You'll find yourself using these M's and Rems quite often, but usually they are based off of some sort of pixel somewhere, even if it's just the root element. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. That's a little bit, I know that we talked a lot about units. Again, you don't really need to memorize this stuff that much. Just know that these exist and know when to use which ones. And then later on, we will dive deeper into all of this while we're building our projects, and we'll see how more of that works in a real world example. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you understand the different units. You can also look at W3 Schools or Mozilla to find out about some more that we didn't cover here, but I covered probably the most used ones, at least the ones that I use the most. I personally, if I'm doing dynamic stuff, I can reason about in my own brain on Rems better than Ms usually, so I will kind of defer to these Rems in most cases. There are some good use cases for Ms, and that being, if I want the same, like from a design standpoint, if I want this title text to be based upon the height of my header, say this whole box was a header across my deal, and I wanted it to be based upon the size of that, and I could scale that, I might use an M in that situation so that all the text in here would scale proportionally. So this text and this text, they would be in relationship to one another. So if this text gets smaller, so does this, and if this text gets larger, so does this, and they're proportionate, and they will always kind of look the same. So if your designer gives you something, they're like, hey, it's really important that these be this, have this proportion to one another, this aspect ratio between these two stays the same, the EMs will be what you want to go with on that. All right, guys. I'm going to stop blabbering for this video, and I will see you in the next video. And in the next video, we are going to talk about specificity, which is not the easiest word for me to pronounce. So specificity, and I will see you there.